grew up in Berkeley, California, which was a great place to grow up as an aspiring jazz musician. I was lucky that my parents were both musically educated, though neither of them played professionally, but we had good music around the house. But the real genius was that the Berkeley High and the Berkeley City schools had a great jazz department. If you can imagine, we had jazz bands starting in 4th grade there. There was one guy, Phil Hardiman, who oversaw the whole program, and if he saw a kid who was interested, he would start feeding you with cassette tapes, that's how old I am, of bands to listen to. So I played in the jazz band at Berkeley High School and met a lot of great players and developed my playing. I studied with a symphony percussionist, Peggy Lou Casey, in San Francisco, and also with a couple of other teachers there in the Bay Area. Went to Cal State Northridge in 1981. Ooh, I just revealed my age. Well, there it goes. Anyway, 1981, Cal State Northridge, got my degree in percussion in 1986. Played in the A jazz band down there for Joel Leach for 3.5 years, toured Japan. And the demo tape that I had coming out of Northridge came from the Northridge record that we had recorded, and I sent that to Maynard Ferguson, and that got me the gig with Maynard Ferguson in 1987. So I toured with Maynard for the better part of 2 years, did 2 records with him, which are hard to find, but they're called High Voltage 2 and the original Big Bop Nouveau album. Great records, but the record company went out of business shortly after that, so they're kind of tricky to find. In any case, back to LA, got married, stayed in LA working as a musician for a good decade without really traveling at all. Started working a great deal with Jack Sheldon and a lot of the other great jazz musicians around. Los Angeles, Bill Holman's band for a couple of years. Who else? Steve Allen I was working with at that time. Found my way into Steve Hufstedter's band and the Phil Norman Tentet for a while. 2000, I went out on the road with Chuck Mangione on a recommendation from the great guitar player Grant Geisman, who was a friend of mine from the Northridge days. And I toured and recorded. I didn't record, but I toured with Chuck Mangione for 10 years. And that was the first real gig where I sang. I was playing drums and singing Children of Sanchez and also Chuck's song Dizzy Miles. So I did that for 10 years and really developed my singing from the drums, which is a big part of what I do now. Came off the road with Chuck. Well, I shouldn't say I came off the road. Chuck stopped working, which is too bad because I loved his gig. And in the time since then, I've just kept busy in LA. A whole lot of records with Cheryl Benteen. I think it's up to 9 now, just playing drums, a little bit of singing on her records and a little bit of scatting. A whole bunch of gigs in Japan when she had connections there. And in 2016, I was on the road as the drummer for Barbra Streisand and did her Music Memories Magic Tour. We had 3 different runs with that and also a Netflix special that we recorded live in Miami. Hoping she goes back out on the road, we'll see. And then meanwhile, developing my own material, starting to write my own songs, starting in the mid to late 90s, and by the year 2007 or so, I had enough material to record a record, so I put out my first album, I Just Want to Get Paid. And then 9 years later, had enough material to put out a second record, and that's where the current album is from. That's Texting and Driving, which is a little bit less than a year old now. And that's about it. Lots of various gigs. Oh, and I played on Michael Bublé's first 3 records. I'm sure I'm leaving out something really important, but in any case, that's kind of the trajectory for me. Getting started in the music business has never been an easy thing to do, and it's, I think, even more difficult now than it was 30 years ago when I was still getting going. When I came out of Cal State Northridge, the goal that we all had was to get out on the road with one of the many touring bands that were on the road in those days. We're talking about 1986, 1987. And so at that time, you could go out on the road with Maynard Ferguson, you could go out on the road with Woody Herman, you could do Count Basie, you could do Thad Jones, Mel Lewis, although drummers didn't do that band, Buddy Rich, a lot of horn players and rhythm section players, and the list went on. And these were groups that were on the road for 12 and 13 weeks at a time. So in school, you were always keeping your eye on having your skill level be where you might be able to submit something to one of those organizations and possibly get an opportunity to prove yourself there. Having made that first ladder step, then people say, well, geez, if he was out with Maynard, he must not be a hack. So then you come back to town and it's a little easier to get rolling. So as far as making those connections, I have to say, I was just talking to a friend about this last night. You keep just putting your name in everywhere. You play 100% the very best you can at every single gig you do, even if it's some dreary wedding or some little in a bar someplace. You treat it like you're playing for Maynard Ferguson or Barbra Streisand right now, because even if the person who hired you doesn't ever call you again, you might meet a bass player or a guitar player, a pianist on that gig, who then calls you in 6 months and says, hey, you know, I remembered you're playing and there's this other opportunity. You have to just keep your excellence level at the very highest, no matter what the situation. Be as versatile as possible. When I got going, by the time I came along, we got the idea. You should be able to play anything somebody asks you to play. So I always tell my students, you want to be able to answer the phone and they say, we have a gig on such and such a day, or we have a tour going out in September, and you can say, great, I'm available. And then you can say, by the way, what is it? And you don't have to worry, is it a reading gig, or is it big band, or is it a funk thing? You know, that's not my specialty. You want to have at least a substantial platform on every style that you can think of so that you can make something work no matter what. Reading is super, super important. And then just being a good person to work with. I can't stress that enough. You have to be the person that people enjoy having there. You're there on time. You are easy to a laugh. You don't bring down the vibe by being all dark or complaining about little details, although I've done my share of complaining over the years. But you try your best to be positive, to be proactive, to not be the one they're having to wait on. Make yourself as hireable as possible. Then when you're trying to make connections, it's going to be through people you've played with. My experience has not been that any large gigs came as a result of just cold call, sending, you know, like a mass audition, or sending a tape or a CD or a file nowadays to some manager's office. People hire people they've gotten recommendations from other people. If Steve Allen wants a drummer, he's going to ask the other people in his existing rhythm section, well, you know, our drummer isn't available for that next gig, who's good? And he's going to trust what they say. So again, it goes back to those connections that you make on the other gigs. My experience has been that when you're on a gig that's something reputable, and then you take a minute and look back at the series of events that led to that call, it's frequently the least likely thing you could possibly imagine. The Michael Buble one is a great example of that. I was in LA just working around, and I was doing a rehearsal for Jack Sheldon's big band just in this sort of dirty back room, not very far from the Musicians Union in Los Angeles. And in walks David Foster with Michael, who had just flown in from Canada and was like 18 years old. And David Foster knew Jack a little bit, and he said, hey, Jack, I've got this kid. He literally just flew in this morning, and I want to hear him sing a little bit with the band. Do you mind taking 15 minutes so we can just read down a couple of stock Sinatra charts with him? And Jack said, sure. So we played, and you couldn't even hear Michael sing because it was just in a rehearsal room. But David Foster was there, and he heard me play. It was about 2 months later on a completely unrelated gig for Ray Anthony, and David Foster was there. And he came up to me after the rehearsal that we did, the sound check, and he said, you're that drummer that was playing with Jack Sheldon the other day, right? And I said, yeah. And he goes, what, are you following me around town? And I said, I'd love to. And he said, give me your card. I like your time feel. So that led to the first call from Michael Buble. And, you know, that's a pretty unlikely series of events. But the fact that you're playing your very best in every situation, even one that maybe you weren't looking forward to, or even one that you thought was just some afternoon rehearsal we're just going to throw down. I didn't know who Michael Buble was when he walked in. It led to some really big gigs. So that's the way you have to approach it. I'm not sure what to say about my initial impressions about the relationship between drumming and then the harmonic structure of a tune. But what I can say is that for me, I always was fascinated by what was going on underneath. I was never, I mean, I liked the drums. I wanted to play the drums, and that was the instrument that I took lessons for. I did grow up in a household with good music playing, and my parents had good records, and my dad used to play a little piano. But a real clue for me was when I first started playing in jazz band, which actually was 7th or 8th grade. That was the first time that I noticed, I remember I had a paper out at the time, and you know how it is when you're rehearsing with the band and you get a tune stuck in your head that you've been rehearsing, so it's just running through your head. So I was out walking around doing my paper out, and I realized that I didn't have the melody of the song stuck in my head. I had the changes stuck in my head. And I wasn't even sure which song it was. I remember just going, let's see, which tune is this? And I had to kind of play through the chord progression a little bit, and then finally get to like the spot where it was distinctive and go, oh, that's Just Friends, you know? I began to realize for the first time that you could really be focused on the root movement and the chord qualities, even though I wasn't educated enough at that time to be able to identify what they were. I didn't know what a half diminished chord was or an extended dominant chord or anything, but I knew the sounds of it, and I immediately started singing simple solos. The more I learned about jazz, the more I found myself just wanting to improvise and getting the idea of working inside the changes. When I was in high school, I started working with some singers around the Bay Area, and I was learning more and more standards, and I was really, really loving the way the American songbook writers worked melody and harmony, and they would, especially with the lyrics included, and they would put that, they'd put that flatted fifth right on the spot where the sad lyric was, you know, and I began to figure out the structure of the thing, like, oh, this isn't just by, the feeling you have inside when you hear that moment in the song is not just by coincidence, it's by design. So then I went to Northridge, and I really filled out my knowledge of harmony as a music major there. And that first year at Northridge was a lot of just going, oh, so that's what they call that thing. That thing that I've heard a million times, that's called a +11. Okay, well, now I know. So I began writing some songs of my own, and more working with singers, more and more working with bands, learning more and more standards and beautiful ballads, and I started singing them more and more. So I was learning the lyrics and not just scatting around on chord changes. To me, there's just no point in writing a song unless you are completely in touch with all the layers of it. That is to say, the rhythmic aspect, of course, coming from the drumming side, the melodic aspect, which everybody focuses on, but the great composers, all of them, Cole Porter and the Sammy Kahns and the Jerome Kerns, the Hoagie Carmichaels, and right up through today with the composers that are writing really wonderful stuff now, they understand about how to work the harmony and the lyric and the melody and arrive at that point that zips right past your analysis. You know, you're thinking about the melody, you're thinking about the chord progression, and there's a certain moment where the combination of melody and harmony and rhythm just zips right past all that analysis and goes right to an emotional response. You just suddenly feel a little bit sadder, or you suddenly feel a little bit happier. To me, that's amazing. So when I write a song, sometimes I start off with a piece of melody or a little chord progression that got my ear. Sometimes I start off with a lyric idea and I work my way backwards. But ultimately the goal is to have all of that be combined together so that the song resonates with the singer and the audience right away. And that's the goal. So to answer the question, I guess I feel like you have to learn about all that stuff or you can't be a songwriter. And actually, it makes you a much better drummer if you're in touch with all of that, because you play differently because of it. If you're a player who's starting out on whatever instrument it might be, you need to make yourself as versatile as possible. And that means being open to every possible style you can learn. I teach at Pasadena City College, so I have a lot of students there, and I also teach for the Los Angeles Jazz Society, and I do a fair amount of clinic work around the country. I'm going to North Dakota State University in a couple of days. And one of the messages that I have for my students, especially because a lot of them are not interested in jazz particularly, they come to me and they're saying, well, geez, why is it you guys are so heavy on jazz? Why are you not teaching us to play heavier rock stuff or whatever? And my answer is usually that that's the jazz music, first of all, is the music that most of these students have been exposed to the least. And I feel like it's an empty space that needs to be filled out to even up their abilities. Most of them can lay down a nice rock groove or a hip-hop thing, but if you ask them to play swing or you ask them to interact in that style, they're not really sure how to go about it. But as a young player starting off, one of the first things I try to head off is a young player who says, well, listen, I'm not really interested in jazz, or I'm not really interested in Brazilian music, or I'm not really interested in whatever. This is my thing is whatever. You're closing doors when you do that. And it's not just that you might imagine that someday you're going to do all this work as a jazz drummer or jazz musician. Maybe you're certain you're not. But here's the really amazing thing to keep in mind. Every single thing you study affects every other single thing you study. So let's say you're just a hard-driving thrash rock guitarist, and you're coming to school and the teachers are talking to you about some other styles of music, and you're thinking, well, this isn't really the music I'm interested in. If you open your mind and just recognize that you are a big empty pot that needs to be filled with more and more and more information, and the more information and the broader palette you have, the better player you're going to be, regardless of what style you end up settling on. There's the possibility you might find out about some new music which you then decide to pursue, but maybe you just end up sticking in the long run with that thrash rock guitar stuff you were doing. But after you've studied Brazilian, and after you've gotten your reading together, and after you've learned to voice jazz chords, after you've learned about the way jazz musicians interact with each other in a very spontaneous way, you start sending your ears down inside aspects of the tune that maybe you never thought about, like the root movement, or the form of the tune, or aspects about the harmonic progression that have emotion built into them. You get used to listening that way, and when you go back to play the thrash rock with that band that you've been playing with for 5 years, you're going to play differently. You're going to be more musically aware. You're going to be more flexible. You're going to be a better player to play with. You're going to make better contributions to the music overall. And you might find yourself getting frustrated with the regimented style that you were used to before. But in any case, if I was a young player starting out, I think probably the first thing I would say is be open-minded. Be open to just learning everything. And if a teacher comes to you with something that isn't a style that you are particularly interested or know about, don't let that be a reason to not give it serious consideration. You step up and say, okay, well, I've got a band director who's got a bossa nova. Now, I've got to learn how to do this. And maybe someday I'm going to play bossa nova professionally, or maybe some of the coordination that I'm going to develop, learning how to play Brazilian stuff, is going to be applicable to some of the stuff that I've already been doing. And all of a sudden, I've got some lick or some idea or a color on the drums, or I'm a guitarist and I've got a voicing that I wouldn't have thought of that I can make use of. So be open-minded, and don't be afraid to put lots and lots and lots of time in. And listen. So your question is, what knowledge do you compile and what advice can I give when it comes time to back up singers? The first thing I can say is you make yourself a much better accompanist to a singer if you become a singer yourself. That certainly has been my experience. You may not be a great singer, but even if let's say you're a pianist and you don't really want to sing publicly, but if you have never really sung, do it in the practice room. Get used to accompanying yourself singing, because out of that, just by doing it, you'll begin to get a feel for what it is that singers need to hear, and what did you do differently accompanying yourself that you can then make use of. To work with singers, it's a special file that I have in my head, and that is not to be derogatory to singers at all, because I've been lucky enough to work with really some of the very finest. I feel like rhythm section players have this incredible advantage that nobody talks about if you do want to become a singer, and that is that we hear more singers than anybody else, even other singers. I've worked with Cheryl Benteen and Barbra Streisand and Jack Sheldon and Michael Buble, and I'm leaving out people that I should be remembering. And I've also worked with people that weren't so good. You develop skills that help you be aware of what's going on with the singer. Do they get a little bit off and need to be helped back in? And of course this can happen with a horn player too. What are the things that I make adjustments as a drummer to make the texture favorable to a singer? Where are the moments where I can hear that if I was the singer standing out front, the texture's getting a little complex, or the texture's getting a little bit over heavy or something? And perhaps a color change will help to highlight the form of the tune or the direction we're going and make it easier for a singer to enter or to go into that next chorus and feel the energy behind them. How do I back them up so that I'm not overtaking them with ideas that I'm injecting in? So I'm thinking a little bit about what is going to work for this person, and every singer is different. You work with Cheryl Benteen and you can play as free as you want because she is rock solid. She's absolutely standalone strong. She can sing every song that she does unaccompanied and start from the beginning and make it to the end of the tune, still be in key, still be in time. So she's really just using the rhythm section as a reference more than anything else, rather than leaning on them to help her. But sometimes you work with somebody who really needs the rhythm section to help guide them through, and you're listening for those details. As a singer, I think about what is it that I need to do to communicate with the rhythm section. Unfortunately, even after all of these years, there remains this communication rift sometimes between vocalists in particular and the rhythm section. And I'm sorry that I still see too many singers coming and working with a trio and being highly dependent on the piano music director to serve as their liaison to the rest of the band. That is to say that maybe this vocalist isn't quite ready to shout out chord qualities and say that's supposed to be an E minor 7 flat 5 chord right there, and you guys just played a regular minor chord, or saying, hey, we're going to key of E flat, or I want to modulate up a half step there. Just harmonic details, theory knowledge. As a singer, you benefit yourself so much if you can turn to the band and speak to them on equal terms. And the band figures that out right away. So then they know that they can come to you and ask a question and you'll have a good answer for them. So the more that vocalists educate themselves theoretically and think of themselves as being, like I was talking about Cheryl, self-contained. You're not depending on anybody to help you get through the song. My message for all the students I deal with, regardless of whether they're rhythm section players or vocalists, is listen to everybody, depend on nobody. You know, I like to take a song that I'm learning, and just like I said, I'll make sure I'm in the right key, and then I'll sing all the way through the head and check at the end. Am I still in the right key? Was there a spot in there where I wasn't quite clear about what the intervals were on the melody? Then can I solo a chorus and still keep the melody in my head? Can I solo a chorus and still keep the form? Do I hear inside myself the chord quality of each chord change of the progression, even though it's not being played in the room by the pianist or the bass player, but I hear it as though it was? If there's a spot in the middle of the song where maybe you're like, I can't quite hear the root in my head there, that's a spot to sit down at the piano, even if you're not a great pianist, and sing the melody and look at the part and say it's an A. Okay, here's the chord progression. So the question ends up really being about the relationship between vocalists and rhythm section players and how you can ease that. Rhythm section players need to be conscious of what it is a vocalist might need from them to make it easier for them to move forward. And vocalists need to make sure that they are as settled and solid in their craft and able to communicate with the rhythm section, just like a horn player or anybody else would. Well, first of all, I want to thank you very much for your reference to Dave Frischberg. Anybody who refers to Dave in regard to my music, I'm beyond honored. I consider him and a couple of others to be really the masters of their craft. And when it comes to lyric writing, boy, I don't think there's anybody. Maybe Jay Lenhart, who writes with the sophistication that Dave did. And you can just tell that he took as long as he needed to write the lyric he was working on. And there's a guy who understood, especially with humor, with any song really, but especially with humorous things, the lyric has to flow off your tongue like you were talking to the person. And if there's any weird moment in there where you had to do a phrase backwards, or there's a forced rhyme that really doesn't belong there, or some other curiosity that distracts the listener from just the pouring out of the story, especially in humor, you lose the joke. So you have to craft humorous lyrics with a special attention to every last detail. And Dave Frishberg is, I think, the ultimate example. Certainly, I've taken his excellence as a goal to shoot for. I've referred to being patient, and I think that when people are writing lyrics, regardless of whether it's humorous or not, what I hear a lot, I've done a few workshops working with lyricists, and I've been a guest for Mark Winkler's lyric workshop class that he does for UCLA Extension. I hear people bringing in lyrics, and it sounds like they had a good idea, but they didn't live with it long enough. They came up with a good basic rhyme. They came up with sort of what I would consider to be a first draft. There's a lot of really obvious stuff in there. There's that one rhyme that kind of doesn't really work. There's that one syllable where the emphasis is on the wrong syllable. All of those are the kind of things that pull the listener out of the story you're trying to tell. So my advice to all of them was, that's a good start, but you need to go back and take as much time as you need to bring this idea to fruition. So my songwriting takes forever. I put out my first album, I Just Want to Get Paid. That's the name of the record. I put that out in 2009, right at the beginning of 2009, and that was the cumulative result of a decade of writing. And I wasn't even trying to write a record, I was just writing tunes. But when I get a tune idea, I goof around with it, and driving to and from gigs or walking the dog, boy, once I'm working on something, it just consumes me. And I'm taking a walk in the evening and I'm just thinking, how can this phrase, it's not singing right. Every time I get to it, I don't want to sing it the way it is. I'll keep messing with it until I finally come up with a solution. And it might take months, and I don't care. Because in 5 years when I sing that song to an audience, they're not going to care that it took months. All they're going to care is that the song rings just right. So if in January I had a pretty good draft of this song and I decided this is good enough, I'm just going to record it, that's the way it's going to be forever. And there's that rough spot in the song. But if I wait until August, when one day I went, wait a minute, I'm going to use such and such a word instead, or I'm going to reverse the order of these phrases, and now it lays right out. You feel the whole lyric just go, and you can just feel that it's right. I'd gladly wait until August to clean up that lyric. So my first message to anybody writing lyrics, especially humorous lyrics, is be patient. I try to avoid forcing myself to come up with humorous things to write about. That is to say that there's always, especially once you put out one record that has humorous things, you sort of feel like, wow, I've got to think of another funny thing to write about. And when I put out I Just Want to Get Paid, I thought, well, maybe this will be my only record, because I'm not gonna walk around going, I've got to think of something funny, you know. I'm always amazed at those writers for the old films who used to work on deadlines. We need a song about dolphins, and it's got to be funny, and we need it by Friday morning at 9, you know, and they cranked it out. I don't work that way particularly, but I just kept waiting until a song idea came to me. So the texting song, which is the title track of Texting and Driving, was just kind of the cumulative result of what I do, and not that I text and drive, but also watching people around me and pondering and noticing how we just can't put our phones down. Look, I'm holding one in my hand right now. And then thinking, you know, there's fodder there. Maybe I can write a tune. So then you set to work with it and you start jotting down just ideas. I just start writing down things I've seen people do. You get about 25 or 30 starting point ideas. Person texting in the middle of a concert, and how funny it is that they think that nobody knows they're doing it, but the entire band can see them because they're shining a bright light on their face, which didn't even make it into the song, by the way. But you just start brainstorming ideas, get a list together, then maybe putting them in order and beginning to sort of tell a story a little bit, get a first draft of just rough, maybe it doesn't even rhyme. Then I go to the piano and start thinking, what seems like it wants to be with this lyric idea? Goof around with progressions. I have a song called I'm Forever in a Fog that's on the Texting and Driving record. And that originally, my idea with that was sort of a snappy little thing about somebody who was so distracted by being in love that they were like running into doorways and banging into things. And I was imagining it as kind of a quick, snappy tune. But when I sat down at the piano with the lyric ideas I had, I started finding more meandering, sort of lost in a fog kind of a progression. And I thought, yeah, you know, that seems like it fits this lyric a little better. This ought to be a meandering chord progression rather than like a Charleston or something. And so the tune grew in that way. You start putting lyrics with melody and harmony, and you start revising. It takes a really long time. But all I can tell you is the satisfaction of finally getting to that point where you've sung the song through inside your car or out walking the dog 100 times. And you finally go, there's not a spot in this lyric that bugs me. There isn't a line that I have to make myself sing. Every single one of them rolls right off my tongue. And you go, I've got it. This is going to be great. That's the way I go about it. So if you're writing funny stuff, and of course it has to be funny. That's one of those little internal things. I can't tell you how to be funny. I can only say, write about what's funny to you. All right, trying to come up with influences and people who have inspired me throughout my career. And I want to just start by saying that I'm probably going to leave out somebody super important, because it's like when somebody says, think of a great song, and you're going to leave out your favorite song for sure. But if I go a little bit chronologically, what I can say throughout all of it, the people who've influenced me the most are the ones who kept reminding me that this is all hard work, but it's also supposed to be fun. And I can think of specific times where that message got through. Very first, I got to thank my parents, Bob and Meg Tull. My father is still with us, and they were very supportive of music. They paid for a lot of drum lessons. They drove me to drum lessons. They came to concerts. They had a good record collection, and they listened to enough jazz and enough classical that there was good music around the house. And my dad remains a supporter of my music to this day. So tons of encouragement there. The very first teacher I studied with was Peggy Lucchese, who was a San Francisco Symphony and Opera percussionist, and I was 10 years old. Having worked with a lot of students over the years since that lesson was in 1973, July of 1973. See how big of a deal that lesson was? I can tell you it was July 11th, 1973. Peggy was a remarkable person to align with first. I'm so lucky because she had that exact thing where she communicated in this very calm and very warm and caring and nurturing way that you need to do the hard work, but you're going to have a great time with it once you get going. So Peggy was just fabulous, and I studied with her all the way to the end of high school, even when I started studying with more drum set players later, but I kept taking from Peggy because I loved going to her lessons so much. Paul Yonemura was the next teacher I hooked up with. He's a jazz drummer in the Bay Area, and he's still a player. And I can list off things that Paul told me, but the one that applies today is that Paul told me, work on all this stuff. Work on this page out of this book. Work on this groove that we're doing. But when you get up on the stage, don't forget, you put all that stuff aside and you have fun and you play. You have a good time when you go up on the stage. You don't worry about whether you're going to miss that paradiddle or whatever. And if you do, you forgive yourself instantly and you move on. That's great advice from Paul. People at Cal State Northridge that really helped. Joel H. was marvelous. The incredible educator Gary Pratt, who just recently retired from Cal State Northridge and really reminded me of how passionate you can be about the music. And then going up through the years, starting to talk about leaders that I worked for, starting with Maynard Ferguson, who I was terrified wasn't going to like my playing or might want me to play something different like the guy before. And the message from him, and also from some of the others that I have been lucky enough to work for. The same thing with Jack Sheldon for all the, hundreds of gigs with him. The same thing with Chuck Mangione was, yes, the excellence has to be there. Yes, you have to play at a certain level, but I want your personality. I want you to play yourself. I don't want you to play like the last guy necessarily. I want you to play good, but I want to hear you. And the players who had that message for me were probably the most inspiring of all. And I'll just never forget really kind of realizing by the third gig with Maynard Ferguson that I was doing some stuff that was different than what I had heard on the record or what I had heard on the gig tapes they had sent, and he was okay with it. And, you know, really kind of building that confidence down inside. I'm sure there are a lot of really great people that I should be mentioning, but I would be wrong to not finish with my wife, who we just celebrated 30 years of marriage. She is a graduate of Cal State Northridge Music Department in flute back in the 1980s, and she didn't pursue a professional career, but she has been the most amazing supporter of my music, and she continues to play to this day. And I can't even count the number of times when I've been writing music or dealing with some difficult leader to work with, and I knew that she would get it, and working especially on the Texting and Driving record that just came out last March, how many times I came to her and said, well, this track would sound so great with strings, and the producer and I and the engineer and I were talking about it, but it's going to cost this amount of money. And she said, you have to do it. You have to do it. It's got to be right. And now is the time to get this the way you want it. And that's always been her message. She's been a constant foundation of support and really helped me get through all the years as a musician, which hasn't been easy, I can tell you. And then my kids, Franny and Henry. And I'll leave it at that.